My own son, the youngest of them all, threw me out of my own house. He didn't even look me in the eye when he said it. He just stood in front of me, arms crossed, and said it coldly. "Dad, you can't live here anymore. Sarah's parents are moving in with us. There is no more room for you." Just like that, without a tremor in his voice, as if I were a piece of old furniture that was no longer useful. In less than an hour, his in-laws were already walking through the front door with their suitcases. And I, with my few belongings, walked out the back. But what my son didn't know was that the house was still in my name. My name is Michael Miller. I'm 73 years old, and I'm no fool. I started in construction at 14, and with my own two hands, I built houses, schools, entire town squares, even the house where I raised my 3 children. I worked under the sun, in the rain, with my back bent and my hands covered in calluses so they would never go hungry. And now, after all that, one of them, the one I helped the most spoiled one, was the one who threw me out as if I no longer mattered. I'm not a man of many words. I've always been a man of action. When my wife died 8 years ago, I felt a part of me die too. But I didn't let it defeat me. I kept going. I poured myself into taking care of my youngest son, who was still living with me. He said he was going to study, that he wanted to start his own business. And I helped him. I paid for his courses, bought him tools, and even gave him the land where we built that house. But with one condition: the property would remain in my name until he was truly responsible. I never imagined that this detail would be what saved me from humiliation. The day he threw me out, I remember I didn't even feel anger at first. I felt an emptiness, as if something inside me had broken. I left with a backpack, a change of clothes, and the property deeds hidden at the bottom. I walked to the neighborhood park. I sat on a bench. And I stayed there for hours, watching people pass by, not knowing what to do. But the more I thought, the clearer it became. I wasn't going to let them treat me like this. I wasn't going to stay silent. I managed to spend that night at the house of an old friend, Bill, who I worked with decades ago. I told him everything, and he just said, "Mike, you don't deserve this. Do what you have to do." The next day, I went straight to the county records office. I hadn't been there in years, but they still knew me. I requested an updated copy of the title for the house, and there it was, crystal clear, no mistakes. The legal owner was still me. Neither my son nor his in-laws had any right to that house. And in that moment, something inside me ignited. I decided I wasn't going to act with shouting or threats. I was going to do things the right way, with paperwork, with the law. Because when you have the truth on your side, you don't need to raise your voice. I hired a lawyer. I showed him all the documents, told him what happened, and he looked at me seriously. Then he nodded. "Mr. Miller, what they did to you is unspeakable. But we can fix this." In less than 2 weeks, my lawyer filed for an eviction order for unlawful occupancy. I didn't say anything to my son. I didn't call. I didn't argue. I just waited for the right moment. And while I waited, I remembered. I remembered the birthdays we celebrated in that house, the Christmases with Johnny Cash playing on the radio, the Sunday barbecues in the backyard, and how my son, as a boy, would hang from my neck, shouting, "Dad, you're my hero." When did all that change? At what point did I stop being his hero and become a burden? Sometimes life forces us to wake up late, but better late than never. That same son who once said, "I don't have a father, I have a rock on my back," was about to understand what it meant to lose what you take for granted, because it's one thing to kick out an old man, and another, very different thing, is to kick out a man who still has his dignity. I don't know if he thought I would never dare, That I would stay quiet, resigned, sitting on a bench waiting for them to apologize. But I didn't come into this world to be anyone's doormat. Not my son's, not anyone's. And if he forgot that, then he was about to receive a lesson that would be etched into his memory for the rest of his life. A week after handing the documents to the lawyer, I received a call. It was from the courthouse. The eviction order had been approved. The officer told me that in 3 days my son would receive the official notification and would have a deadline to leave the house. I didn't need to do anything else. I didn't lift a single finger against him. I didn't confront him. I didn't yell at him. I just let the law speak for me. And for all the years he had decided to forget. I spent those days at my friend Bill's house, eating hearty stew with fresh bread, sleeping on an old cot that creaked with every movement, but sleeping in peace because I no longer carried that rage in my chest. What I felt now was something else, something colder, firmer. It was the certainty that I was doing the right thing. It wasn't revenge, it was justice, because you don't do that to a father, and much less to a father who gave you everything. The day the sheriffs arrived at my house, I wasn't present. I didn't want to be. I didn't need to see my son's face when he read the papers. I imagined it, of course. Walking barefoot through the living room, hearing the doorbell, opening it lazily, thinking it was the food delivery guy. And suddenly, seeing the process server handing him the sealed envelope. I imagined the exact moment he saw the name that signed that order. Michael Miller. His own father. That afternoon, not even an hour passed before my cell phone rang. It was him. I didn't answer. He called 3 more times. Then came a flood of messages. Some were insults. Others were pleas. He told me, how dare I, that his wife's parents had nowhere to go. That how could I leave him on the street? He asked if I didn't love him anymore, if I had gone crazy. But the curious thing was that in none of those messages was there an apology. Not a single word of remorse. That night, I slept more soundly than ever. And the next day, I went to the house. Yes, my house. I arrived slowly, without warning. The facade was neglected. There was trash at the entrance, and the plants I had cared for years were dry, abandoned. I knocked on the door. My son's wife opened it. She looked at me as if she had seen a ghost. Her face was distraught. Behind her, her parents were packing in a hurry. Suitcases, blankets, even a blender wrapped in a towel. No one said anything. They just left, one by one, with their heads down. My son appeared at the end of the hallway. His eyes were red. I don't know if from crying or from lack of sleep. He looked at me. And for a second, I thought I saw the boy I raised. The one who ran to me when I came home from work. But I said nothing. Neither did he. He just passed by me, dragging his suitcase. As he left, he muttered something barely audible. "You went too far, Dad." And I, without raising my voice, replied, "No, son. You went too far first." When I closed the door, the silence inside the house was heavy. I walked through the hallways. Everything was changed. The furniture, different. The family photos, disappeared. In their place, modern, cold, soulless paintings. I went to my room, or what used to be my room. They had turned it into an office. No trace of my things. Only an old chair remained, the same one where I used to sit and read in the afternoons. I sat down, and there I allowed myself to cry. I cried for the betrayal, for the distance, for everything I gave, and for everything that was not valued. I cried because I didn't want to reach this point, because deep down, everything I did in my life was for them, for my children. But you can't allow them to trample on you just because you love them. You have to set boundaries, even if they hurt. Because if you don't, you lose yourself. The days passed. I started to fix the house little by little. I planted flowers in the garden again. I painted the walls. I reinstalled the portraits of my wife, my grandchildren, my parents. That place became my home again. Not just a roof, but a space full of history, of roots. Because I wasn't finished, I still had a lot to give. Not to those who rejected me, but to myself. My son tried to contact me several times after that. He wrote me letters. He looked for me at the market. He asked acquaintances to talk to me. But he never apologized. He never acknowledged what he did. He just said that he needed me, that I was his dad. But son, being a father is not a title that is repeated for convenience. It is a bond that is cared for. Or it breaks. I have no hatred in my heart. I did not raise him to destroy him. But I am not willing to give away my dignity either. I don't have much time left in this life, I know. But what I have left, I want to live in peace. Without false smiles. Without carrying guilt that does not belong to me. And it was on one of those days while I was arranging some boxes in the closet that I found an old notebook. There were my notes, my accounts, my memories. And on the first page, written in my handwriting from years ago, it said, "Everything I have is for those who know how to value it." I closed that notebook and promised myself that it would be so. One morning, while I was sitting on the porch having my coffee and a pastry, I saw the mailman pass by. He left me a white envelope with no return address. When I opened it, I saw a handwritten page with a script I recognized immediately. It was from Sarah, my son's wife. "Mr. Miller," it began, "you can't imagine how much everything you did has affected my family. My parents are now living with my sister in another state. We are going through a lot of hardship. But the reason I'm writing is not for you to help us, but for you to know that, despite everything, I still don't understand why you took the house from us." I folded the letter carefully. I put it on the table. I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. Did she really not understand? Did she not understand that what they did was like stabbing me in the back? That the house was never theirs? That they simply occupied a space that didn't belong to them and threw me out as if I were an intruder? It wasn't revenge, ma'am. It was justice. One that you never thought I would have the courage to seek. The days continued peacefully. I started to get back into my routine. Sometimes I would go to the town market, other times to the church where I always sat in the back pew. Some acquaintances would approach me to ask why my son was no longer around the neighborhood. Not everyone knew the story, and I had no need to tell it. I just answered with a serene smile. He went his own way. Because even though I had every right to say more, I preferred silence. Sometimes silence says much more than 1,000 words. One afternoon, while I was watering the plants in the garden, I heard footsteps approaching on the sidewalk. I turned around. It was my grandson, Ethan. He must be about 15. He came with a backpack and a look of doubt on his face. He greeted me respectfully, but with a mixture of shyness and sadness. "Can I come in, Grandpa?" he said. I nodded and invited him to sit in the shade. We spent more than an hour without talking about what was important. He told me about school, about his friends, about how his mom now had to work more hours. I just listened. I knew that at some point he would say what he really came to say. And so he did. Just as he was about to get up, he looked me in the eyes and said, "Dad's not doing well. He doesn't stop talking about you. He says it was unfair. But he doesn't say it with anger. He says it with shame." I sighed. I patted his shoulder and answered calmly, "Your dad made choices, and choices have consequences. But you, son, are not to blame for anything. This will always be your house too." I gave him a long hug, one of those that heals, and I watched him walk away down the same path he had come, with his shoulders a little straighter and his eyes a little clearer. That night, I kept thinking about how one bad decision can break a family, but also how time sometimes heals, even if it doesn't erase. even if it doesn't repair everything. Some things break and can't be put back together the same way. But still, you can move forward. With scars, yes, but also with dignity. A few days later, I went back to the records office with my lawyer. I asked him to draft a new will. I didn't include my youngest son's name. It hurt. Of course it hurt. But it was necessary. Instead, I put Ethan's name, and I made it very clear. If one day he respects me as a man and as a grandfather, he will have the right to everything. But only if he learns to recognize the value of his roots. I'm not looking for revenge. I never was. I just wanted them to understand that a father is not disposable, that an old man still feels, still thinks, still has a memory, and that when justice doesn't come with shouting, it comes with facts. And so, little by little, I started to come back to myself. I began to rescue my small pleasures, my little garden, my old radio with country music, my notebook of poems from my youth. Because even though my family turned their back on me, I didn't turn my back on myself. It was a Thursday morning when everything started moving again. The lawyer called me early while I was sweeping the patio. "Mr. Miller," he said, "there's something you need to know. Your son has filed an appeal to try to get the house back, claiming that you're acting out of spite and that he and his family were unjustly left on the street." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because it was like watching the wound try to bleed again, just when it had started to scar over. "And what do we do?" I asked without raising my voice. "Nothing, Mr. Miller. We have all the documents. He has no way to prove anything. But you should know that he's going to try to confront you." I thanked him for the call, hung up the phone, and just stared at the newly swept floor. Seriously? After everything? He still had the audacity to fight for a house he didn't build, didn't pay for, and didn't respect? That same afternoon, I received an unexpected visit. It was Mrs. Gable, a neighbor for life, a wise woman, one of those who knows everything that happens in the neighborhood without leaving her garden. She knocked on my door gently, and when I opened it, she greeted me with a sad look. "Mike, your son was around here. He was asking if you were alone, if there was a way to approach you." I thanked her for the information, but I didn't say anything more, because what hurt me wasn't that he was asking about me. It was that he was only doing it after he had run out of options. Sometimes you think that with age you become immune to certain things, but you don't. Every time someone mentioned his name, I felt something in my stomach. Not hate, not anger. Something more like disappointment wrapped in love, because a father's love doesn't just disappear. It becomes silent, like a river that continues to flow underground, even if you can no longer see it on the surface. A week later, I received an official letter. It was the notification of the appeal my son had filed. I read it completely, word for word. It said that I was unbalanced, that I no longer thought clearly, that I had acted out of spite and the confusion typical of my age. When I finished reading it, I didn't tear it up. I saved it, because one day, when he is old, I want him to read it, so he understands how much it hurts to be treated as if you're no longer useful, as if experience, years, gray hair were a defect and not a blessing. My lawyer responded to the letter firmly. There was no need to exaggerate. The facts spoke for themselves. The deed to the house, the records, the witnesses. Everything was clear. It was only a matter of time before my son's desperate attempt came to nothing. And deep down, I already knew that. But I needed to go through that last chapter to truly close it. A few weeks passed, and one ordinary afternoon, when the sun was beginning to set, I heard footsteps on the sidewalk again. I peeked through the window. It was him, my son, alone, with his hands in his pockets. He was walking slowly, like someone who doesn't know if they're coming or going. I stood motionless, watching. I didn't go out. I didn't open the door. I just watched him stop in front of the house, look up, and stand still, as if waiting for something, maybe a sign, maybe a word. But he didn't get one, because I didn't offer one. After a few minutes, he turned around and left, and I don't know if it was pain or relief that I felt, maybe a mixture of both. But that night, I slept deeply, for the first time in a long time, without dreams, without being startled awake, because I understood that sometimes love is also knowing when to close the door, even if it breaks your soul to do it. A few days later, I ran into Ethan again. He came to bring me some bread from his mom. He hugged me tightly, as if he knew I needed it. And he told me something I'll never forget. "Grandpa, no matter what happens, thank you for teaching me to have dignity." And that was worth more than any apology that never came. Because if just one grandchild understands, if just one learns, then none of this was in vain. And so I continued, with my coffee in the mornings, my garden slowly coming back to life, and my soul breathing again. Because you don't need to have a full house to feel complete. Sometimes it's enough to have a peaceful heart, and to know that even if the world turned its back on you, you remained standing. That morning I woke up earlier than usual. It had rained during the night, and the smell of wet earth brought back memories of when I built that house with my own hands. I was then just over 30 years old. My children were small. They ran barefoot among the bricks and bags of cement. We didn't have much, but there was joy. And now, standing in front of that same window, looking at the same garden that I used to water with my wife by my side, I felt that this place had changed, not only because of what they did, but because of what I learned after what they did to me. I went to the kitchen, prepared my coffee in the old percolator, toasted a piece of bread with butter, and sat in my old wooden chair, the one that creaks every time I move. From there I could see the street. The neighborhood wasn't the same. Many new neighbors, many renovated houses, but I remained firm. And in silence, I began to write in my notebook. Not a letter, not a complaint, but a kind of testimony, a way to leave in writing what I lived, so that one day whoever wants to understand can read it. Today I understood, I wrote, that one does not grow old because of the years, but because of the wounds that are left open. And the worst are those inflicted by your own children. As I was writing, I heard a knock on the garden gate. Not forcefully, but a soft tapping, as if with knuckles. I peeked through the window. It was Ethan again. He came alone, with a small bag in his hand. I opened it and offered for him to come in. "No, Grandpa, I just came to leave you this. It's from Mom. She said it was your favorite food." It was pot roast, made just the way I liked it, with roasted potatoes and carrots on the side, and dinner rolls wrapped in a kitchen towel. I thanked him with all my heart. And she also asked me to tell you that she doesn't agree with what Dad did. That she only went along out of fear, out of pressure. That what happened wasn't fair. I sighed. I put a hand on his shoulder, and I replied, "Son, we all have to learn to be responsible. Sometimes fear makes us act badly, but that doesn't erase the damage we cause." He looked at me in silence, and before leaving he said, "I do value you, Grandpa. I do remember everything you did." And he left, walking slowly as if the conversation weighed on him. But I was left with a new relief in my chest, because if one branch of the tree is still healthy, there is hope. That same day, later, I received a call from an unknown number. I answered cautiously. It was the lawyer. He informed me that my son's appeal had been officially rejected. He tried everything, he told me, But the law is clear. You acted correctly within your rights. He can no longer claim anything. I closed my eyes and felt a kind of rest, not of triumph, because this was not a victory. It was simply the end of a legal wound, the rest, the emotional part, that was still healing. I decided to go for a walk. I went to the center of town. I passed by the square where I used to take my children when they were little. I sat on the old bench, the one with a loose board for more than 10 years. I stayed there, watching people pass by. Couples, grandparents with their grandchildren, street vendors. And I realized something. One can have every right to feel hurt, to seek justice, but one also has the duty not to let that wound become poison. Because while I did not deserve what they did to me, I also did not want that pain to define me. When I returned home, I found a letter at the door. It was not in an envelope, just folded. It was from my son. It said, "Dad, forgive me. Not for what I did, but for not having understood before everything that you were. I lost something that cannot be recovered. I lost your trust, and even if you don't let me come back, I just want you to know that now I see it. That now I do understand." I held the letter in my hand for a long time. I did not answer it. It was not necessary, because there are apologies that arrive when they are no longer useful. Not because they don't hurt, but because they come after respect. And without respect, no apology can rebuild what was broken. That night I opened my notebook again. I wrote another line. There is no worse abandonment than that which is disguised as maturity. Because there are children who believe they are growing up, when what they are doing is forgetting those who made them grow. I had dinner alone, but in peace, and went to sleep with a lighter heart. Because I understood that I am not less for being alone. I am more for having known how to choose not to stay where I was no longer valued. The next morning, while preparing my breakfast, something inside me told me it was time to put an end to all that. I'm not talking about forgetting, because you don't forget that you were thrown out of your own house, but about taking the reins, about letting go of what no longer belonged to me and looking forward again. I prepared strong coffee, the way I liked it when I worked on construction sites, and sat in front of a blank paper. Not to write a complaint, but to do something I had never done before. To write my story, with all its truths. I started at the beginning. My name is Michael Miller. I was born in a small town in the Midwest, where men learn to work before they learn to talk. I was a construction worker, a carpenter, a father, a husband, and although life never gave me luxuries, I always had the most important thing: respect. But one day, the respect I gave was not returned to me. With each sentence, I felt a lump in my throat. Because words not only tell, they also liberate. And I needed to let go. I had already written 3 pages when someone knocked on the door. It was Mrs. Gable, my neighbor. She came with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Cornbread, Mike, the kind your wife liked. I thought of you this morning." I thanked her with all my soul. I invited her in, but she only sat for a little while on the threshold. "I've seen you calmer these days," she said, "as if you've already let go of the weight." I nodded. Because yes, something had changed in me. Maybe not on the outside, but on the inside. I was no longer the same. That afternoon, I went for a walk with my cane. Not because I needed it completely, but because it gave me rhythm. I passed by the market, greeted some old friends, and ended up sitting on the usual bench, the one facing the church. I ran into Father John, a good man who had known me for years. He sat next to me, without saying much. Sometimes the silence between two people who understand each other is more valuable than 1,000 pieces of advice. "Mike," he said after a while, "life takes many turns, and it doesn't always end as we expect. But you have done something that many do not dare to do. Set boundaries, and that is also love. I didn't know what to answer. I just took a deep breath, as if letting those words sink to the bottom of my soul. Because yes, setting boundaries is not resentment, it is self-love. When I returned home, I found a bag hanging on the gate. Inside, a box with some local sweets, an old photo of me with my 3 children, and a note. Even if you don't believe it, Dad, we still think of you. It was not signed, but I knew who had left it. I stood for a long time looking at that image. It was from when they were children. I was hugging them. Everyone was smiling. And for a moment, I remembered what it was like to be an admired father. But nostalgia did not bring tears this time. Only a melancholic peace, like someone who understands that time does not stop. But dignity doesn't either. That night I returned to my notebook. I wrote with a firm hand. One does not become old when one gets gray hair, but when one stops defending what one has built with one's soul. Because that was what I had done. Defend my story, not for pride, but for justice. Because if you stay silent, others believe they can trample on you forever. The next morning I received another letter, this time from the court. It was the official closing of the case. My son had no way to appeal. The house was legally protected in my name again, without interference. I read it all, calmly. I was not happy, but I felt firm. Like a tree that, after many storms, remains standing with deeper roots. I decided to do something symbolic. I went to the back of the yard, where there was an old rose bush that my wife cared for with so much love. It was dry, abandoned for years. I bent down, turned the soil, pruned the dead branches, and I planted a new rose bush. Not for nostalgia, but for hope. Because even though much has been lost, something can always bloom again. While I was working on it, I heard a voice behind me. It was Ethan. He came with a notebook in his hand. "Grandpa," he said. "In school, they asked us to write about someone we admire. And I wrote about you. Can I read it to you?" I wiped my hands on my pants and gestured for him to sit next to me. His voice trembled a little, but each word was like a balm to my soul. "My grandfather is a man who does not shout but teaches, who does not hit but makes it clear what is right, who did not let himself be trampled on, even though they tried, and that is why I admire him." When he finished, I couldn't help but hug him. A long hug, without words. Because in that instant, I felt that all the pain, the humiliation, the abandonment had been worth it just for that moment. Because if I managed to make at least one person understand what respect, justice, and self-love are, then I did not fail as a father, or as a man. The days passed, slow but calm. The morning air had a different smell, as if the atmosphere knew that something in me had changed. I no longer woke up with a tight chest, nor with my mind full of painful memories. I began to dedicate myself to simple things, but that for me had weight. Sweeping the patio calmly, painting the rusty gate, arranging the old photo albums, organizing the tools in the workshop at the back that I had abandoned since my wife's death. Because after everything that happened, I understood something very clearly. You can lose people. You can lose bonds. But as long as you don't lose yourself, something is saved. One morning, while I was sharpening some old pruning shears, I heard someone calling from the gate. It was Bill, my lifelong friend. He came with his usual hat and a sincere smile, the kind that needs no explanation. "Mike," he said as soon as he entered, "you don't know how proud I am of you. What you did, not everyone does." I invited him to sit in the shade of the orange tree, served him some fresh lemonade, and we talked for a long time. He had been with me from the beginning. When I went to his house with my backpack on my shoulder, after my son threw me out, he offered me a corner, a blanket, and his silence. Because sometimes a true friend is not the one who gives you solutions, but the one who sits with you to wait for the calm to return. "And now, what are you going to do?" he asked me as he looked at the new rose bush that was sprouting strongly. "Are you going to stay here alone?" I was thoughtful, not out of fear, nor out of sadness, but because that question touched a deep chord. What happens after a storm like that? Do you stand on the ruins or start building again? I answered him honestly. "I'm going to stay, Bill, but I'm not alone. I have Ethan, I have my peace, and I have my story, and that's already a lot." He nodded in silence, with that wisdom that only years and life's blows can give. After Bill left, I sat down to write again. My notebook was already half full. It was not a diary. It was more of a legacy, a testimony that old people are not finished, that we still have a voice, that we can also say enough and take the reins. I wrote a sentence that I later underlined with force. It's not about being respected for being old. It's about being respected because you gave everything. And that's what I had done. I gave everything. Time, money, care, a roof, advice. And when they betrayed me, I did not return with hatred, but with justice. Because justice is not always shouted. Sometimes it is executed in silence, with papers in hand and head held high. The next day, while I was preparing a chicken and vegetable soup, my late wife's recipe, I thought about my son again. Not as the man who threw me out, but as the child he once was, the one who fell asleep on my chest, the one who waited for me at the door with open arms when I came back from the construction site. And I wondered at what point he stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me as an obstacle. Maybe it was modern life. Maybe it was his ambition. Maybe it was comfort. But whatever it was, it did not justify what he did. You don't kick a father out of his house for convenience. You don't trade the one who gave you life for your wife's parents just because it's more comfortable. After lunch, I went out to water the plants and see how the rose bush was progressing. It already had several new shoots. I observed it calmly, and suddenly an image crossed my mind. Myself, old, but sprouting again. Because when you take care of yourself, listen to yourself, honor yourself, you also flourish, even if you have been stepped on before. That same afternoon, Ethan returned. He brought a small box wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something we made in class, Grandpa. It's a model of our family." When I opened it, I saw cardboard figures. There was his mom, himself, and a doll with a white beard and a hat. Clearly me. His father was not there. And before I said anything, he explained. "The teacher told us to put the people who are really there for us." I shivered inside, because I understood everything. That child had already chosen with his heart, without resentment, but with clarity. I hugged him tightly, and as I did, I felt that a part of me, the one that was still bleeding, began to heal. Because there is no more powerful balm than the sincere recognition of a grandchild. More than an apology, more than an inheritance, more than any reparation, that simple cardboard model gave me back something I thought I had lost: meaning. That night, I turned on the old lamp in the hallway, the same one I hung with my hands more than 20 years ago, and I sat down to read the pages of my notebook from the beginning. There was sadness in it, yes, but also strength and a lot of truth. Because when you write from experience, each line is a closing scar. And when I reached the last page, I wrote in large letters, "The wound no longer bleeds. Now it is history. And this house, this life, this old man, are still standing." A few days had passed since Ethan brought me that cardboard model. I had it on the shelf, next to a photo of my wife that I never moved. Every time I passed by, I looked at it, and I felt a strange mixture of sadness and pride, because in that simple gesture from my grandson, I understood that although they had taken many things from me, they had not taken the most important thing: the respect of someone who still has a clean heart. That Sunday, I woke up with a special calm. It was sunny, and the breeze brought the smell of freshly baked bread from the neighbor's house. I prepared a coffee and sat at the entrance with my old hat, the one I used to wear when we went to the flea market with my wife. As I took the first sip, I saw my son in the distance, walking on the opposite sidewalk. He had nothing in his hands. He was not dressed sloppily, but he no longer had that arrogant air. He was looking at the ground with his shoulders slumped. He saw me, but he didn't cross. He just lowered his gaze and continued on. And in that instant, I understood that something in him had also changed. But it was too late. I remained silent. I didn't move. I didn't call him. I didn't yell at him. Because when someone decides to turn their back on their blood, they also renounce the words that one is no longer obliged to offer. Sometimes silence is the only way to say, "You can't enter here anymore." And not out of revenge, but out of dignity. That afternoon, I started organizing the house papers. Titles, receipts, deeds, will. Everything in order, with Ethan's name as the heir, very clear. I also wrote a letter for him, not for now, for when I'm no longer here. In it, I told him who I was, how I built that house, what I lived through, what I endured, and why I made the decision to leave everything to him. Because one day, when he is a man, I want him to know that his grandfather did not let himself be crushed, that he acted with justice, but also with love. A love that does not condone abuse, but that builds with memory. While I was putting away the documents, I found an envelope with some old photos that I hadn't seen in years. There we all were. My wife, my 3 young children. Me with my face burned by the sun and a tired but happy smile. I stopped at one where my youngest son was hugging my neck, with his bare feet and his face dirty from playing so much. He was a cheerful, sweet, full-of-life child. And I asked myself, once again, at what point was he lost? At what point did he stop seeing me as his father and start seeing me as an obstacle? Maybe I'll never have that answer. Maybe he himself doesn't have it. But I learned that not all questions deserve an answer. Some just need time and distance. During the following days, I began to write what my grandson called Grandpa's Stories. It was a new notebook where every night before sleeping I wrote down an anecdote from my life. Some happy, others hard, but all true. I did it not for myself, but for those who come after, so that one day, if Ethan wants to tell his children who his grandfather was, he won't have to invent anything. Just read. One night, while I was writing a story about how I met my wife, dancing at a town party, under paper lights, and with dusty shoes, I heard a light knock on the door. I opened it. It was Sarah, alone, with no makeup on her face and swollen eyes. She looked at me with an expression she had never shown before. Respect. "Mr. Miller, I know I have no right, but I had to come." I nodded and offered her a seat on the bench at the entrance. I said nothing. She began to speak with a broken voice. She told me that her life had not been easy since everything that happened, that her parents had to go live with a sister, that my son had changed a lot, that he was depressed, that he spoke little. I listened in silence as she spoke. I replied, "Everyone reaps what they sow. I gave you everything. And you chose to kick me out of my own house. Don't hate me for having taught you that actions have consequences." She lowered her gaze. She was not looking for compassion. She just wanted to say that, despite everything, she was grateful for what I had done for her son in the past. That now she understood things she didn't see before. She said goodbye with a handshake, and as she was leaving, I felt that, at least on her part, there was a lesson learned. Not a reconciliation, but a recognition. The following days were more serene. I planted corn again in the small space behind the house. I bought paint and renewed the front door. I cleaned the windows inside and out. The house looked different. And so did I. Because when you clean your space, you also clean your soul. That same week, Ethan came to spend the night with me. We watched old movies. We ate bread with hot milk. And we talked about simple things. About the future, about what he wanted to study, about his dreams. He told me he wanted to be an architect, that he wanted to build houses, like his grandfather. And then I knew that everything I lost was not in vain. That life took a son from me, but it gave me a grandson who inherited what matters: the value of truth, the weight of one's word, and the strength of someone who does not give up. There was something different in the air that morning. It wasn't just the weather, nor the singing of the birds in the orange tree in the yard. It was an internal feeling, as if my body was telling me something important is going to happen today. I got up slowly, stretching my bones as if I were dusting off the years. I prepared my breakfast calmly: scrambled eggs, refried beans, and a little fresh cheese. And I sat down to eat at the usual table. In front of the window, overlooking the garden, the rose bush was in bloom, red, strong, open to the world. Like me, I thought. Like me now. As I was clearing the plates, I heard the engine of a car stop in front of my house. I didn't look immediately. It wasn't necessary. I felt who it was, and I was not mistaken. A few seconds later, someone knocked on the front door. Firmly. 3 dry knocks. I walked over. I opened it slowly. And there he was, my son. He was thinner. His hair was disheveled. The dark circles under his eyes were marked. His voice, however, came out serene. "Dad, can I come in?" I looked at him without answering. I just stepped aside. He entered like someone not treading on their own ground, with his eyes exploring the environment as if it were the first time he had seen it. He sat on the edge of the sofa, with his back straight, his hands clasped. I sat in front of him, without rushing, without empty words. "I know I don't deserve to be here," he began. "And I didn't come to ask you for anything. I came because I needed to close this." I nodded, giving him permission to continue. After everything that happened, I was left with a lot of things inside. Resentment, reproaches, but also shame. A lot of it. I let myself be carried away by Sarah, by the pressure, by plans that were not mine. But in the end, the decision was mine. It was I who threw you out. And you don't know how many nights I have woken up thinking about that. Seeing you walk out the door with your backpack. Me standing there, believing I was doing the right thing. I raised my hand gently, not with anger but with clarity. "Son," I said, "memory is not erased with words. What you did was not a mistake. It was a choice. A very conscious one. It was not an impulse. It was cold, calculated, and it hurt, like you can't imagine. But I learned something. I don't need your forgiveness to be at peace. I needed my own, and I already have it." He fell silent. He swallowed. He lowered his gaze. I realized that he did not expect that. Maybe he came looking for an emotional moment. A scene of tears and hugs. But I was no longer that father who let everything pass for love. Not anymore. And not because I stopped loving him, but because I learned to love myself too. "And now," he finally asked, "is there no longer a place for me in your life?" I looked at him firmly. There is a place for those who respect, for those who acknowledge, for those who repair. Not with words, but with actions. You still have a lot to learn. There were no shouts. There was no drama, just that raw truth, spoken from a heart that had healed with effort. He stood up. He extended his hand. I shook it. Not as a gesture of reconciliation, but of closure, of farewell. Maybe momentary, maybe definitive. He understood. He left in silence, without looking back. And when I closed the door, I took a deep breath. I felt that the last link of that chain that tied me to the pain had broken. That same day, I wrote again. Sometimes children get lost, not out of malice, but out of cowardice. But a father is not obliged to carry that flight. He is obliged to live in truth, to set limits, to protect his peace. The following days, I dedicated to myself. I went to the workshop at the back and started building a small wooden bench. I wanted to put it under the rose bush, something simple but firm, like the foundations of this new stage that I had built with my own hands. Ethan helped me sand it. Every time he came, he brought a new story from school, about his plans, about his crazy ideas of designing floating houses or bridges that crossed rivers that did not yet exist. And I just listened to him, smiling inside. Because in him there was something that had been lost in his father. The ability to see the other, to look with love. One afternoon, while we were painting the bench with varnish, Ethan told me, "You know, Grandpa, when I grow up, I want to make a house like this. Not the same on the outside, but the same on the inside. A house that has stories, silence, respect, and a garden where something that matters grows." I remained silent, watching the sun go down between the branches of the orange tree, and I knew, without a doubt, that he had understood everything. That night, as I closed my notebook, I wrote, "The strongest tree is not the one that was not cut, but the one that knew how to grow new roots after the blow." And I fell asleep with a clear conscience. Not because everything ended well, but because I ended up faithful to myself. Today I sat on the new bench for the first time. The rose bush next to me already has open, vibrant, firm flowers. The afternoon sun caressed my face while the wind moved the leaves, as if they were singing something that only old people understand. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the light weight of well-lived years. I have no riches. I have no crowds visiting me every Sunday. I have no recognition in the newspapers or medals hanging on the wall. But I have peace. I have my story written with calloused hands and with decisions that I did not seek, but that I faced with my soul upright. And that, for me, is worth more than any title. Months have passed since that last visit. My son has not returned, and I do not expect him to. Sometimes you don't need reconciliation to move forward. Sometimes forgiveness is not given out loud, but in the way one decides not to carry the pain of others anymore. I let him go. And in that act, I also let myself go, because I understood that the real punishment for those who hurt is not revenge, nor rejection, nor contempt. It is being left with the echo of their own decisions. He will live with that. I will not. Ethan still comes every weekend. Sometimes he stays overnight. Other times he just stops by to say hello, to tell me things about school, to show me his drawings. The other day he brought me one of a house in the middle of the woods, with high ceilings, wooden walls, and a swing at the entrance. "It's your house, Grandpa," he said. "But when I build it, you'll have one just like it in heaven." I laughed tenderly, and I also felt a lump in my chest, because in his words there was a simple and powerful truth. The love we sow flourishes, even when we are no longer here. The people in the neighborhood have started to look at me differently, not as the old man who was thrown out of his own house, but as the man who knew how to defend his place with dignity. They greet me with respect. Some ask me how I did it, And I always answer the same. By not silencing what hurts. By not bowing my head when they step on you. By not giving your heart without it being deserved. Because if there is one thing I want to make clear before I go, it is that old people are not defeated. We are alive, and we have a history, and history is not negotiable. I recently finished my notebook, 83 pages, each with a part of me. I left it in a drawer, with a note for Ethan. When I'm gone, read it slowly. Not to cry, but to understand. There are no fairy tales here, only life. Because that's what's left in the end, right? The life we lived, what we did with what we were given. And I, with mine, did the best I knew how. Maybe I wasn't perfect, but I was just, and that's enough. Today, I also finished organizing my papers. Everything is clear, everything is signed. The house is Ethan's, not because he is the favorite grandchild, but because he was the only one who stayed when everyone else left. The only one who listened, the only one who asked me for nothing, and yet gave me everything. My will does not have millions. It has this house, this garden, this rose bush, and my name, written on every brick, on every step of cement, on every crack that no longer hurts. Sometimes I feel lonely. Of course I do, I'm not going to deny it. There are nights when I miss the laughter, the hugs of my children when they were little, the voice of my wife in the kitchen. But loneliness is not always an enemy. Sometimes it is a teacher. It taught me to value myself, to listen to myself, to choose my battles. And above all, not to be afraid of silence, because in silence I found truths that the noise never let me see. And if someone were to ask me if I would do everything the same again, I would say yes, that I would give again, trust again, build again, forgive again. But I would also close the door again when it was necessary, sign papers when others betrayed me, plant a rose bush when everyone thought that land was dead. Because as long as you breathe, as long as you have a memory, you can always start over. Today, as I write these last lines sitting under the sun, with moist eyes but a straight back, I only have one thing left to say. If you who are listening to me are going through something similar, do not stay silent. Do not forget yourself. Sometimes even love needs a limit, because whoever does not respect you does not deserve to stay. And whoever values you would never put you on the street. And that is why, my dear friend, that I say with my heart in my hand, it is never too late to return to your center. It is never too late to take your place. Now you tell me, if you had been in my place, what would you have done? And also tell me, where are you listening from today? Because if this story touched your heart, maybe that was just what you needed to hear.